My name is Ashley. I'm 33 years old, and I thought I'd finally reached a point in my life where I could juggle everything being a single mom, a working woman, and the glue that held together the fragile illusion of family whenever we gathered. I thought I could take one more family vacation, grit my teeth, and pretend that the old wounds of favoritism and cruelty didn't matter anymore. I thought I could swallow the bitterness for the sake of my daughter. But what happened that week showed me just how wrong I was. It started like any other family trip. My parents insisted, as they always did, that we all travel together once a year. They called it a tradition. I called it endurance training for the soul. Still, my daughter, my bright, gentle 14-year-old, was thrilled about this year's destination. She'd been begging to go for months, and I caved. Sometimes, as a single mother, you step into the lion's den just to give your child a chance at a memory they'll treasure. The trip included my parents, my sister, with her perfect husband and her perfect kids, and me, with my not-so-perfect little family of two. From the outside, we must have looked wholesome 3 generations, laughing, smiling for photos. But behind the brochures and fake smiles, our vacations were battlegrounds. Every meal was a debate, every activity, a competition, every mistake, a chance for someone to twist the knife. Day one at breakfast, my daughter leaned toward me, her voice quiet, almost embarrassed. "Mom." My stomach hurts. She pressed a hand against her belly. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, just a whisper. Before I could even respond, my mother snapped, "Oh, please don't start with the drama already. We just got here." My sister snorted into her coffee. She's probably just trying to get out of walking. Lazy like always. The cousins, sensing blood in the water, chimed in with their cruel chorus, "Drama queen, drama queen." My daughter shrank in her chair. She hates attention, hates conflict. And yet, no matter how quiet she tried to be, they always cast her as the center of it, the villain, the problem, the spectacle. Watching her curl into herself that morning, cheeks burning with shame, I felt something inside me fracture. I remembered being her age, sitting in the same seat, hearing the same words. By midday, the pain hadn't eased. She walked slower, pale and sweating, clutching her side as she trailed behind the group. My father barked at her to keep up his voice as sharp as ever. "Don't milk it." "You're fine," my mother muttered under her breath. "She's always been like this. Anything for attention." My sister rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might stay that way. And my daughter, my sweet girl, just nodded silently, trying to keep pace, desperate not to be mocked again. I wanted to scream. Instead, I wrapped an arm around her shoulders and whispered, "It's okay, baby. I see you. I believe you." By dinner, her lips were trembling, her fork untouched. She sat rigid at the table, eyes glistening, while the rest of the family clinked glasses and laughed at jokes made at her expense. My sister leaned into her husband and whispered something, and their kids erupted into snickers. I asked what was so funny, but they just smirked and said, "Nothing." Then it happened. She pushed her chair back, maybe to head for the bathroom, maybe just to escape the table. But before she could take a step, her legs buckled beneath her. One moment she was standing, the next she crumpled like a puppet whose strings had been cut, hitting the floor hard. The room went silent for a split second. I held my breath, expecting panic, concern, action. But instead, my mother broke the stillness with a groan. "Oh, for heaven's sake!" As if my child collapsing in agony was nothing more than another performance. That was it. Something inside me detonated. I didn't argue, I didn't plead. I scooped my daughter into my arms, yelling for help, demanding a cab, demanding anyone with half a soul to move faster. My family. They stayed seated. Not one of them followed me out the door. The hospital was a blur of cold white lights, the rush of nurses, the clipped voices of doctors asking questions I could barely process. My daughter writhed in pain on the bed, her hand gripping mine with desperate strength. I tried not to cry, tried to be steady for her, whispering over and over, "It's going to be okay. I've got you." I texted updates to the family. No response. I called twice. No one answered. Hours dragged by, test after test. I paced the sterile hallways, the weight of helplessness crushing me. Finally, desperate for distraction, I checked my phone. And that's when I saw it. A photo posted an hour earlier. My parents, my sister, her perfect kids, cocktails in hand, grinning by the pool. The caption read, "Finally having peace without the pathetic drama queen." I froze. My daughter, my baby, was in a hospital bed fighting through pain, and they were out there celebrating her absence, mocking her, mocking me. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the phone. Rage surged hot and bitter through me. I wanted to scream, to storm back to the hotel and drag every last one of them to the hospital to watch her gasping for breath. I wanted them to choke on their laughter, but I didn't. Instead, I sat there beside her bed, holding her clammy hand in mine, and something in me shifted. The years of dismissals of being called the disappointment, of watching my sister bathe in golden child adoration while I was left in the shadows, it all crystallized into a single razor-sharp thought. They've crossed the line. There's no going back. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I decided. They weren't going to get away with it. If you want to understand why that photo by the pool broke me the way it did, you have to understand the history behind those so-called family vacations. My parents called them a tradition, a yearly bonding ritual. But for me, they were nothing short of masochism dressed up in matching t-shirts. Every summer since I can remember, we've packed ourselves into cars or planes and set off to some destination that looked wonderful in the brochures. Beaches, ski resorts, rustic cabins, city getaways, you name it, we did it. To outsiders, we probably looked like the picture-perfect American family tan smiles, coordinated outfits, group photos in front of landmarks. But behind every snapshot was tension so thick you could cut it with a butter knife. It always started the same way. My parents would set the tone cheerful bossy, pretending they hadn't already picked favorites. My sister Marissa, the golden child, would immediately step into her role as the star of the show, and I, as always, would be relegated to the shadows. If I spoke up, my mother's voice would tighten. If I laughed too loudly, my father would sigh. If I dared to disagree, the cousins would chime in with that word they'd branded me with years ago, drama queen. The irony, I've never liked drama. But in my family, cruelty was the sport, and someone always had to be the entertainment. That someone was me. And now they were training my daughter to wear the same crown of thorns. When she was little, she used to adore these trips. She didn't understand the digs, the subtle jabs, the way her aunt would compare her to her cousins and always find her lacking. She just wanted to swim in the pool, eat ice cream, and collect seashells. But as she got older, she began to notice. The cousins' whispers, my sister's smirks, my parents' sighs. Still, she looked forward to this trip more than any before. The destination was a city she'd been begging to see for years. She counted down the days on her calendar, buzzing with excitement. And I caved. I packed our bags, swallowed my dread, and told myself, if it makes her happy, I can handle the circus for a week. That's the thing about being a single mom. You walk willingly into the fire just to give your child one spark of joy. But the fire always burned hotter than I expected. The first day as we gathered for breakfast in the hotel's grand dining hall, it was all so familiar it was almost laughable. My father ordered everyone's meals without asking. My mother criticized the waiter's hair. My sister announced that her kids were top of their class again while mine sat there poking at her toast, looking smaller by the second. When she whispered that her stomach hurt, I knew what was coming. The pounce, the ridicule, the sneers masked as jokes. "Don't start with the drama already," my mom said. "We just got here." "She's probably faking to get out of walking," Marissa added loud enough for the entire table to hear. And just like that, the chorus began. Drama queen, drama queen. It was like a family sport waiting for a weakness, then circling like sharks. The worst part wasn't even their cruelty. It was the look on my daughter's face, the way her cheeks flushed pink. Her eyes darted to me like she was begging me not to make it worse. She was learning the same way I once did, that in our family pain was entertainment. I tried to brush it off to tell her quietly it would be okay, but inside I felt the old bitterness rising like bile. Because every insult thrown at her was a recycled insult once thrown at me. Every smirk at her expense was a smirk I'd endured for decades. And there I was watching history repeat itself. The truth was, I had spent my entire life on these family trips pretending the digs didn't sting, pretending the favoritism wasn't obvious, pretending the weight of being the disappointment wasn't crushing, and now my daughter was walking the same tightrope, trying to shrink small enough to avoid their blows. But here's the thing about tradition: just because something has been done for years doesn't mean it deserves to continue. That morning, watching her tuck her pain away so she wouldn't be laughed at, I felt the first flicker of resolve. This would be the last time my daughter ever had to play their game. Day 2 of the trip started deceptively calm. The sun was sharp and golden, the kind of morning that should have felt full of promise. My daughter walked beside me, clutching her water bottle a little tighter than usual. She hadn't said much since breakfast the day before. I noticed the way she held her stomach when she thought no one was watching, how she lagged a few steps behind as we shuffled through the crowded streets. I leaned down and whispered, "You okay, sweetheart?" She nodded too quickly. "I'm fine, Mom." But her pale face betrayed her words. Of course my family noticed too, and like wolves catching the scent of blood, they pounced. We had barely walked 2 blocks before my dad turned around, irritation plain in his voice. "What's the holdup she's dragging already?" My mom sighed dramatically. "Ashley, honestly, you've coddled her too much. She just wants attention. You were exactly like this, always pretending something was wrong to get out of things." I froze at that. Pretending. That word had been used against me my entire childhood. If I was sick, I was pretending. If I cried, I was pretending. If I succeeded at something, they'd pretend it didn't matter. And now they were labeling my daughter with the same brush, as if cruelty could be passed down like an heirloom. Marissa, my sister, smirked, brushing a strand of her perfect highlighted hair out of her face. "Maybe she just can't handle a little walking. Not everyone can keep up, I guess." Her kids, mini replicas of her cruelty, snickered. One of them, her oldest, muttered under his breath, "Drama queen," just loud enough for my daughter to hear. I saw my daughter's jaw tighten, her lips pressing together to keep from saying anything back. She hated conflict even more than I did at her age, and I knew exactly what was running through her head. If I speak up, it'll only get worse. If I cry, they'll laugh harder. That broke me. Because I remembered doing the same thing, swallowing down the lump in my throat, forcing a smile, trying to convince myself their laughter was just a joke and that I was being too sensitive. Watching her walk with her arms wrapped around her stomach, shoulders hunched, was like watching a mirror of my own childhood. By lunchtime, she could barely eat. She pushed her plate away after a few bites, her eyes darting nervously around the table. I wanted to say something: "She's sick, can't you see that?" But I knew how it would play out. My parents would roll their eyes, my sister would accuse me of being overprotective, and the cousins would turn it into a chant that would echo in her ears for the rest of the day. Still, I couldn't stay silent forever. "She's not feeling well," I said, quietly placing my hand on her shoulder. My dad slammed his fork down. "Not feeling well. We spent money on this trip. She can't just sit around all day. She needs to toughen up." Marissa leaned across the table, her voice syrupy sweet but sharp as glass. "Maybe she's just trying to copy you, Ash. You know, being the family victim gets you a lot of attention." The table erupted into chuckles. My daughter's eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. She picked at the edge of her napkin, shrinking smaller and smaller in her chair. I wanted to scream at them to drag her away and never come back, but I didn't. Not yet. Because deep down, I still wanted to believe it would stop. That if I kept the peace, if I didn't cause a scene, the trip could still be salvaged for her. That's the lie I'd always told myself with my family. Maybe this time will be different. But by dinner, I knew better. My daughter barely touched her food. Her face was pale, her movements sluggish. The cousins snickered into their plates, whispering to each other while casting glances at her. My mom leaned over to Marissa, not even bothering to lower her voice. "She's making a scene out of nothing, just like her mother always did." Marissa smirked. "Some things really do run in the family." My daughter's eyes flicked up to mine, and for a split second I saw pure panic there. Not just pain, but fear. Fear that she was becoming the same scapegoat I had always been. And that was the moment I realized they weren't just mocking her illness. They were grooming her into their next target, my replacement in the family theater of cruelty. I sat back in my chair, my jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. They thought this was just another game, another round of humiliate Ashley and her kid until they cry. But what they didn't know was that this time the rules had changed. because I wasn't that powerless child anymore, and they weren't just messing with me, they were messing with my daughter, and I would burn the entire stage down before I let that happen. By the time dinner rolled around, I knew something was wrong. My daughter had been moving like a shadow all day, her steps slower, her smile non-existent. She barely spoke, and when she did, her voice trembled. I kept telling myself it was exhaustion, maybe dehydration, maybe just the weight of being mocked relentlessly for 2 straight days. But deep down, that gnawing mother's instinct told me this was different. This was serious. We sat at a long table in the resort's restaurant, dimly lit with chandeliers that cast a golden glow over polished silverware and glasses of wine. The atmosphere buzzed with vacation laughter, other families chattering, waiters rushing by with trays of food, the clinking of forks against plates. For everyone else in that room, it was just another pleasant evening. For us, it was the beginning of a nightmare. My daughter pushed her plate away after barely 2 bites. She sat stiffly, her shoulders hunched, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Her lips were pale, her eyes wet. I leaned over and whispered, "Sweetheart, do you want to go back to the room?" Before she could answer, my mother cut in, her voice sharp. "She doesn't need special treatment. She's just trying to get out of eating the food." Marissa chuckled, flicking her perfect hair over her shoulder. "Classic. She's turning into you, Ash." Always something wrong, always the center of attention. The cousins snorted into their napkins, whispering "drama queen" like it was the funniest joke in the world. My father, without even looking up from his steak, muttered, "If she's not going to eat, at least stop fidgeting. You're making the whole table uncomfortable." I wanted to scream, to grab my daughter's hand and walk out. But before I could even process the rage bubbling in my chest, it happened. She stood slowly like she was heading for the bathroom. Then her knees buckled. Her hands shot to her stomach as she gasped, her face twisted in agony. And then she collapsed. One moment she was upright, the next, she was crumpled on the floor, her body curling inward, her breath coming in sharp, shallow bursts. Her fork clattered to the ground, her chair screeched against the tile. For a split second, the entire restaurant fell silent. Conversations stopped. Forks froze in mid-air. Every eye turned toward us. I shoved my chair back so fast it nearly toppled. "Baby, talk to me." I dropped to my knees beside her, my hands shaking as I tried to keep her steady. Her skin was clammy, her eyes wide with terror. And what did my family do? Did they rush to help? Did they shout for a doctor, for a medic, for someone to call an ambulance? No. My mother sighed, loudly, exasperated, as if my daughter's collapse had interrupted her meal. "Oh, for heaven's sake!" Marissa rolled her eyes and muttered, "Not this again." "And my father." He just leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, his jaw tight with irritation. "Ashley, you've coddled her too much. She's milking it." I stared at them in disbelief. My child was gasping on the floor, and they thought it was a performance. Something inside me snapped. A cold, sharp line etched itself in my mind, the line between tolerance and rage, between being their scapegoat and being my daughter's protector. I scooped her into my arms, her body limp and trembling, and shouted across the room, "Somebody call an ambulance!" The other diners sprang into action instantly, proving that strangers had more humanity in them than my own flesh and blood. A waiter rushed to the phone. A woman handed me water. A man pressed a napkin into my free hand. Meanwhile, my family stayed seated. My sister whispered something to her husband, and I caught the curl of her lips into a smirk. My parents just looked annoyed, like I'd staged the entire thing to ruin their dinner. I didn't have time for them. By the time paramedics arrived, my heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst. I climbed into the ambulance with my daughter still clinging weakly to my hand. The sirens wailed, drowning out everything else. I remember glancing back one last time as the ambulance doors slammed shut. Through the restaurant's glass windows, I saw them, my family, already turning back to their meals. They didn't follow, they didn't call, they didn't care. That was the moment I knew they weren't just cruel. They were dangerous, and I wasn't going to let them hurt her the way they had hurt me. The ambulance ride was a blur of red lights bouncing against dark windows. My daughter's small hand clutched mine, trembling, while the medic barked clipped phrases into a radio. Her breathing was shallow, her face pale, her body curling tighter with every jolt of the van. I whispered over and over, "It's okay, sweetheart, I'm right here. I'm not leaving." But the words felt thin against the scream of sirens. At the hospital, fluorescent lights swallowed us whole. White walls, the smell of antiseptic, nurses in scrubs moving too fast, asking me 100 questions I could barely answer. When did the pain start? Any allergies? Has this happened before my daughter was wheeled away toward an exam room, her eyes wide with terror, her fingers stretching for mine until the doors closed between us? I was left standing in the hallway, heart pounding, the echo of her cry still in my ears. Hours blurred into each other. I paced, sat, stood again, paced more. My phone buzzed in my pocket and I pulled it out with shaking hands. I had texted the family when we first arrived. She collapsed. "We're at the hospital. We'll update." Not a single reply. Not one. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. I bought a watery cup of coffee from a vending machine just to have something warm in my hands. My mind spun with possibilities: appendicitis, food poisoning, something worse. My thoughts kept circling back to the darkest corners, the ones no parent wants to imagine. At some point, I checked my phone again. No missed calls, no messages. Desperate for distraction, I opened social media. And there it was. A photo posted just an hour earlier. My parents, my sister, her husband, and their kids all lined up poolside at the resort. Drinks in hand, smiles stretched wide. The caption hit me like a knife. Finally having peace without the pathetic drama queen. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My daughter was lying in a hospital bed, wires taped to her chest monitors beeping steadily, and they were celebrating her absence. Not just ignoring her pain, mocking it. Mocking her. Mocking us! The phone shook in my hands. My throat burned. A scream clawed at my chest, desperate to get out, but I swallowed it down. I wanted to throw the phone across the sterile hallway, to storm back to that hotel and drag every last one of them here to watch my child suffer. But instead, I sank into a plastic chair, staring at the glowing screen until the words blurred. It wasn't just about tonight. It was every year, every vacation, every dinner table where I'd been the punchline, every rolled eye, every muttered insult, every sigh that told me I wasn't good enough. And now they'd shifted their cruelty onto her, my daughter, the only person in this world who looked at me like I was enough. That was the moment something inside me crystallized. I wasn't going to fight with them anymore. I wasn't going to beg for scraps of love or attention. I wasn't even going to scream about the cruelty of that caption. No, I was going to act, quietly, precisely, the way they'd never see coming. A nurse touched my arm gently. "You can see her now," she said. I stepped into the room, and there she was, curled under a thin hospital blanket, her face soft with exhaustion monitors blinking gently beside her. I brushed the hair from her forehead, leaned close, and whispered, "You're safe, baby. I've got you." But inside my mind was already building something colder, sharper than grief. They had crossed the line tonight, and they would pay for it. Sitting in that hospital chair, watching my daughter sleep under the thin fluorescent glow, I couldn't stop my mind from drifting backwards. Trauma does that. It ties the present to the past, forcing you to relive every scar. Her pale face, her tiny hand curled around mine. It was like looking into a mirror of my own childhood. Because this wasn't the first time cruelty had been my family's entertainment. It was just the first time they'd turned it on her. Growing up, my sister Marissa was the golden child. 2 years older, smarter on paper, prettier in my parents' eyes. Every breath she took was treated like a miracle. My mother used to beam when Marissa recited a poem in school. When I did the same, "Stop trying to copy your sister." Teachers compared us, and my parents nodded along like a jury with their verdict already written. Why can't you be more like her? My father's sighs still echo in my head, heavy with disappointment. I tried. God, did I try? I studied harder. I practiced smiling in the mirror, hoping if I perfected it, maybe I'd finally earn praise. I dressed neater, walked straighter, bent myself into every shape they demanded. But it didn't matter. Because no matter how hard I tried, I wasn't Marissa, and in my family, not Marissa was synonymous with failure. The label followed me everywhere. If I cried, I was being dramatic. If I succeeded, it was a fluke. If I failed, it was proof. And eventually, I stopped trying to prove them wrong. I swallowed their disappointment until it became part of my DNA. By the time I was a teenager, the pattern was carved into me so deeply I didn't even notice when I chose a boyfriend who treated me the same way. He was cold, manipulative, impossible to please. He mirrored my parents so perfectly it was almost comforting. Toxic felt familiar. When I ended up pregnant at 19, I thought maybe things would change. Maybe finally I'd be seen as important. A mother. Someone with purpose. I can still remember the day I told them. My mother's lips tightened like she'd sucked on a lemon. My father muttered figures, and Marissa, ever the queen of empathy, smirked and said, "Well, at least now you'll have something to do." I thought the baby's father would anchor me, but he only chained me deeper into a cycle of cruelty. It fell apart quickly, mercifully. And when he left, I was terrified, but also relieved. Because for the first time, I wasn't alone in the world. I had my daughter, and she changed everything. She was tiny, helpless, and yet when she looked at me, really looked at me, I felt something I'd never felt in my life worth. She needed me, depended on me, and that meant I mattered, even if it was only to her. But of course my parents weaponized even that. Single mother. Shameful. Irresponsible. A cautionary tale for Marissa to shake her head over while she paraded her perfect husband and perfect kids around the living room. There was one person, though, who never joined in. My grandmother. She saw me. Not the failure, not the shadow of Marissa. Just me. She loved my daughter with a ferocity I'd never witnessed. I'd watch her cradle my baby, whispering lullabies, her wrinkled face glowing with pride. Sometimes I'd stand in the doorway, heart aching, realizing, so this is what love is supposed to look like. When my grandmother passed, the entire family assumed the house would go to my mother. My father spoke of it like it was already his. Marissa started talking about redecorating before the will was even read. But my grandmother wasn't a fool. She'd lived long enough to see who they really were. And she made a choice that shocked everyone. She left the house not to me but to my daughter, in trust, with me as guardian until she came of age. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Who leaves property to a toddler? But then I remembered the way she'd looked at my daughter, like she was sunlight, like she deserved protection, like she deserved better than this family's cruelty. My parents lost their minds. My mother cried betrayal. My father said my grandmother was confused at the end. Marissa whispered about tradition and culture, insisting the house should pass to an adult, not a child. They stormed and raged, but the will was clear. And yet, I was so conditioned to bow, to shrink, to apologize that I didn't enforce it. I didn't throw them out. I let them stay. I told myself it was easier not to rock the boat. So the cycle continued. I raised my daughter in the same house where I had been raised to believe I was a failure. Every insult, every sigh, every jab echoed through those walls. And now, watching her in that hospital bed, I finally understood the truth. This wasn't just about appendicitis. This wasn't just about one cruel caption on social media. This was the same cycle that had crushed me now, curling its claws around my daughter. And for the first time in my life, I felt the weight shift. Because I had something they didn't know how to handle. I had leverage. The steady beeping of the monitor beside my daughter's bed was like a drumbeat in my ears, forcing me to sit with my thoughts. For years, I had pushed them down, locked them in a corner of my mind, but now they rose to the surface, relentless. My grandmother's face, her hands, her words. She had been the only one who looked at me with gentleness, the only one who didn't sigh when I entered the room, or compare me to Marissa, or mutter that I was a disappointment. She was fragile in her last years, her hair thin, her body frail, but her eyes never dimmed. They were sharp, steady, knowing. I remembered one evening years ago. My daughter was barely a toddler asleep in her crib. I was sitting at the kitchen table exhausted from a double shift, fighting tears because my parents had spent the entire day reminding me how unfit I was as a mother. My grandmother shuffled in, sat beside me, and took my hand in hers. "She's your light," she whispered, nodding toward the sleeping baby. "And this house will be her shield." At the time, I didn't understand what she meant, but when the will was read after her passing, it became clear. The house, our home, wasn't left to my parents. It wasn't left to me. It was left to my daughter in trust with me as guardian until she was grown. The room that day erupted into chaos. My mother cried like she'd been betrayed by her own flesh and blood. This was supposed to be mine. She's confused. She didn't know what she was doing. My father's voice boomed, claiming the will must have been tampered with, and Marissa. She sat rigid, her smile cracking like porcelain, whispering about tradition and fairness, her eyes already glinting with envy. But the ink was clear. The house belonged to my daughter. I should have celebrated. I should have stood tall and said this is her legacy, her protection. But years of conditioning silenced me. I let them stomp through the halls like they still owned them. I told myself it was easier that way, not to fight, not to draw blood. So I let them stay. They filled the rooms with their voices, their rules, their disdain, while I raised my daughter under the same oppressive roof that had once suffocated me. Every insult became wallpaper. Every sigh seeped into the walls. And every day I promised myself I'd break the cycle. Someday. But someday never came. Not until the poolside selfie. Not until the caption that mocked my child as she lay in agony. Not until I realized that my grandmother's gift wasn't just property. It was power. I pulled the deed out of the folder I kept buried in a drawer at home, running my fingers over the words. My grandmother's handwriting still lingered on the margins of an old note she'd once left for me. Protect her. One day, you'll need this. The truth settled heavy in my chest. She had known. She had seen them clearly stripped of the masks I kept trying to force onto them. She had left me the one weapon that could shield my daughter from the cycle of cruelty. For years, I hadn't used it, but now, as I sat beside my daughter's hospital bed, I realized this was the moment my grandmother had prepared me for. This wasn't just about eviction. This wasn't just about property. This was about drawing a line in the sand that could never be crossed again. I reached over and brushed the hair from my daughter's forehead. She stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open just long enough to whisper, "Mom." "I'm here," I said softly, my throat tight. "I've got you. Always." And for the first time in my life, I believed those words not as a promise, but as a truth. Because now, I had the means to make them real. The doctor came into the room with the kind of expression that never bodes well, serious, clipped, efficient. His voice was flat, almost mechanical, like he had said these words hundreds of times before appendicitis. "The appendix hasn't ruptured yet, but we need to operate immediately." The world tilted for a second. My daughter was only 14. She was supposed to be shopping for souvenirs, laughing at silly tourist attractions, eating ice cream by the pool, not lying under harsh hospital lights while surgeons discussed cutting into her. I nodded quickly, forcing steadiness into my voice. "Do whatever you have to do. Just save her." They wheeled her away on the bed, her frightened eyes locked on mine, until the doors swung shut. And then silence. I sat alone in the waiting area, the sterile air pressing down on me. I pulled out my phone again, more out of habit than hope. I thought maybe, just maybe, my family would have come to their senses by now. Maybe they'd call asking for updates. Maybe they'd show up even grudgingly. But my notifications were empty. Not a single missed call. Not a single text. The only lingering image was that poolside photo my parents, my sister, their kids, all of them laughing, cocktails raised while my daughter was being prepped for surgery. The caption echoed in my head like poison, finally having peace without the pathetic drama queen. I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles whitened. My first instinct was to text them again. She needs surgery. She could die. To force them to understand the gravity of what they had dismissed as drama. But then I stopped myself, because I already knew how it would go. If I told them the truth, Marissa would roll her eyes and claim I was exaggerating. My mother would say, "See, always a crisis with Ashley." My father would mutter something about weakness. And my daughter, if she ever found out, their reaction would carry that wound forever. So I didn't text, I didn't call, and they didn't either. The surgery took 2 hours, the longest 2 hours of my life. I sat hunched in the waiting room chair, my mind spiraling through every worst-case scenario. What if something went wrong? What if she didn't wake up? What if I walked out of this hospital alone? I closed my eyes and forced myself to breathe. No, I thought. She's strong, stronger than they'll ever know. When the surgeon finally came out, he gave me a small nod. The operation was successful. She'll be weak for a while, but she'll recover fully. My knees nearly buckled with relief. I whispered a thank you that felt too small for what he had just given me, my daughter's life. Later, when I was allowed back into her room, she was curled under a blanket, her face pale but peaceful. I sat by her side, stroking her hair gently, my heart still pounding from the adrenaline that hadn't yet let me go. I should have been sobbing with relief. I should have been celebrating the fact that she was safe. But instead, a cold, sharp clarity seeped into me. Because the people who should have been here, her grandparents, her aunt, her cousins had chosen cocktails over compassion, laughter over loyalty, and in that choice they had revealed themselves completely. They didn't just fail her, they abandoned her. And abandonment, I realized, wasn't something you could forgive. As I watched my daughter sleep, her chest rising and falling steadily, I made myself a promise. Never again would I let these people define her worth or mine. They thought they held the power in our family, that I would always bow, always stay quiet, always keep the peace. But sitting in that hospital chair, my daughter safe but fragile beside me, I understood something new. The power was mine now, because I had the will, I had the deed, I had my grandmother's shield in my hands. And this time, I wasn't going to waste it. The hospital room was dim except for the green and yellow blips of the heart monitor. My daughter slept soundly after the surgery, her breath slow and steady. I sat in the stiff plastic chair, my body exhausted, but my mind alive with a new kind of energy. Sharp, electric, dangerous. For 33 years, I had played by my family's rules. Stay quiet, endure, swallow the pain, pretend it doesn't hurt. I'd let them dictate the story, Ashley the dramatic one, Ashley the failure, Ashley the cautionary tale. But watching my daughter writhe on the hospital floor while they laughed by a pool that had rewritten everything, I opened my purse and pulled out a folder I hadn't touched in years. I had brought it with me on the trip almost by accident, stuffed in with my bills and paperwork. Inside was the copy of my grandmother's will and the deed to the house. My daughter's house. Her shield. For so long I had let it sit there like a relic, a piece of paper I was too afraid to wield. But now, as I ran my fingers over my grandmother's signature, her words came back to me. One day you'll need this to protect her. That day had come. I reached for my phone. My thumb hovered over my mother's contact for a moment, an old reflex tugging at me tell her what happened, make her see reason, beg her to care. But then I laughed bitterly to myself. Reason, care. She had made it clear. They all had. They weren't going to change. So I dialed a different number, a lawyer I had met years ago through a friend. He answered on the second ring, his voice low and professional. "Hello, this is Daniel Brooks." "Daniel, it's Ashley," I said. My voice was steady, calmer than I expected. "I need to enforce a will." He didn't hesitate. "Whose?" "My grandmother's. She left her house in trust to my daughter. I'm the guardian until she's 18, but my parents, they've been living there as if it's theirs. And now," I trailed off, glancing at my daughter in the bed. The words came out sharper. "Now they've crossed a line." There was a pause, papers shuffled on his end of the line. Then, "Do you have documentation?" "I have everything." "Then it's straightforward. We can file notice immediately. They'll have 30 days to vacate." 30 days, 1 month. After years of swallowing their cruelty, all it would take was 1 month to finally be free of them. "Do it," I said. When I hung up, I didn't feel fear or guilt, just a cool, quiet satisfaction like sliding a puzzle piece into place. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to their cruelty. I was planning, strategizing, acting on my own terms. The next few days, blurred with hospital routines, doctors checking vitals, nurses adjusting IV drips me spoon-feeding broth into my daughter's mouth, and watching her strength return little by little. Through it all, my phone remained silent. No calls from my parents, no visits, Nothing but the occasional update on social media of them playing happy family. Good. Let them enjoy their cocktails. Let them bask in their illusion of control. They had no idea that the foundation of their world was already crumbling beneath them. When we were finally discharged, I drove my daughter home in silence, her head resting against the window, too tired to talk. The house loomed before us, the same house I had grown up in, the same house where every insult still echoed in the walls. But this time I didn't see their fortress. I saw my battlefield. That night, after tucking my daughter into her bed and kissing her forehead, I walked downstairs and sat at the kitchen table. I spread out the documents, the will, the deed, the notice Daniel had emailed me freshly printed. My grandmother's handwriting seemed to glow against the paper. I placed the notice in the center of the table, weighed down by a mug, perfectly positioned so that when they walked through the door, it would be the first thing they saw. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to fight. All I needed was ink on paper and 30 days. The silence of that kitchen was heavy, but for once it wasn't suffocating. It was power. And I knew exactly what I was going to do with it. The hospital room was dim, except for the green and yellow blips of the heart monitor. My daughter slept soundly after the surgery, her breath slow and steady. I sat in the stiff plastic chair, my body exhausted, but my mind alive with a new kind of energy, sharp, electric, dangerous. For 33 years I had played by my family's rules. Stay quiet, endure, swallow the pain. Pretend it doesn't hurt. I'd let them dictate the story, Ashley the dramatic one, Ashley the failure, Ashley the cautionary tale. But watching my daughter writhe on the hospital floor while they laughed by a pool that had rewritten everything, I opened my purse and pulled out a folder I hadn't touched in years. I had brought it with me on the trip almost by accident, stuffed in with my bills and paperwork. Inside was the copy of my grandmother's will and the deed to the house. My daughter's house. Her shield. For so long I had let it sit there like a relic, a piece of paper I was too afraid to wield. But now, as I ran my fingers over my grandmother's signature, her words came back to me. One day you'll need this to protect her. That day had come. I reached for my phone. My thumb hovered over my mother's contact for a moment, an old reflex tugging at me. Tell her what happened, make her see reason, beg her to care. But then I laughed bitterly to myself. Reason, care. She had made it clear. They all had. They weren't going to change. So I dialed a different number, a lawyer I had met years ago through a friend. He answered on the second ring, his voice low and professional. "Hello, this is Daniel Brooks." "Daniel, it's Ashley," I said. My voice was steady, calmer than I expected. "I need to enforce a will." He didn't hesitate. "Whose?" "My grandmother's. She left her house in trust to my daughter. I'm the guardian until she's 18. But my parents, they've been living there as if it's theirs. And now?" I trailed off, glancing at my daughter in the bed. The words came out sharper. "Now they've crossed a line." There was a pause. Papers shuffled on his end of the line. Then, "Do you have documentation?" "I have everything." "Then it's straightforward. We can file notice immediately. They'll have 30 days to vacate." 30 days. 1 month. After years of swallowing their cruelty, all it would take was 1 month to finally be free of them. "Do it," I said. When I hung up, I didn't feel fear or guilt. Just a cool, quiet satisfaction, like sliding a puzzle piece into place. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to their cruelty. I was planning, strategizing, acting on my own terms. The next few days blurred with hospital routines, doctors checking vitals, nurses adjusting IV drips me spoon-feeding broth into my daughter's mouth and watching her strength return little by little. Through it all, my phone remained silent. No calls from my parents, no visits, nothing but the occasional update on social media of them playing happy family. Good. Let them enjoy their cocktails. Let them bask in their illusion of control. They had no idea that the foundation of their world was already crumbling beneath them. When we were finally discharged, I drove my daughter home in silence, her head resting against the window, too tired to talk. The house loomed before us, the same house I had grown up in, the same house where every insult still echoed in the walls. But this time, I didn't see their fortress. I saw my battlefield. That night, after tucking my daughter into her bed and kissing her forehead, I walked downstairs and sat at the kitchen table. I spread out the documents, the will, the deed, the notice Daniel had emailed me freshly printed. My grandmother's handwriting seemed to glow against the paper. I placed the notice in the center of the table, weighed down by a mug, perfectly positioned, so that when they walked through the door, it would be the first thing they saw. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to fight. All I needed was ink on paper and 30 days. The silence of that kitchen was heavy, but for once, it wasn't suffocating. It was power. And I knew exactly what I was going to do with it. The hospital room was dim, except for the green and yellow blips of the heart monitor. My daughter slept soundly after the surgery, her breath slow and steady. I sat in the stiff plastic chair, my body exhausted, but my mind alive with a new kind of energy, sharp, electric, dangerous. For 33 years I had played by my family's rules. Stay quiet, endure, swallow the pain, pretend it doesn't hurt. I'd let them dictate the story, Ashley the dramatic one. Ashley the failure. Ashley the cautionary tale. But watching my daughter writhe on the hospital floor while they laughed by a pool that had rewritten everything. I opened my purse and pulled out a folder I hadn't touched in years. I had brought it with me on the trip almost by accident, stuffed in with my bills and paperwork. Inside was the copy of my grandmother's will and the deed to the house. My daughter's house, her shield. For so long I had let it sit there like a relic, a piece of paper I was too afraid to wield. But now, as I ran my fingers over my grandmother's signature, her words came back to me. One day you'll need this to protect her. That day had come. I reached for my phone. My thumb hovered over my mother's contact for a moment, an old reflex tugging at me, tell her what happened, make her see reason, beg her to care. But then I laughed bitterly to myself. Reason, care. She had made it clear. They all had. They weren't going to change. So I dialed a different number. A lawyer I had met years ago through a friend. He answered on the second ring, his voice low and professional. "Hello, this is Daniel Brooks." "Daniel, it's Ashley," I said. My voice was steady, calmer than I expected. "I need to enforce a will." He didn't hesitate. "Whose?" "My grandmother's. She left her house in trust to my daughter. I'm the guardian until she's 18, but my parents, they've been living there as if it's theirs. And now." I trailed off, glancing at my daughter in the bed. The words came out sharper. Now they've crossed a line. There was a pause, papers shuffled on his end of the line. "Then, do you have documentation?" "I have everything." "Then it's straightforward. We can file notice immediately. They'll have 30 days to vacate." 30 days. 1 month. After years of swallowing their cruelty, all it would take was 1 month to finally be free of them. "Do it," I said. When I hung up, I didn't feel fear or guilt. Just a cool, quiet satisfaction like sliding a puzzle piece into place. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to their cruelty. I was planning, strategizing, acting on my own terms. The next few days blurred with hospital routines. Doctors checking vitals, nurses adjusting IV drips me spoon-feeding broth into my daughter's mouth, and watching her strength return little by little. Through it all, my phone remained silent. No calls from my parents, no visits, nothing but the occasional update on social media of them playing happy family. Good. Let them enjoy their cocktails. Let them bask in their illusion of control. They had no idea that the foundation of their world was already crumbling beneath them. When we were finally discharged, I drove my daughter home in silence, her head resting against the window, too tired to talk. The house loomed before us, the same house I had grown up in, the same house where every insult still echoed in the walls. But this time I didn't see their fortress. I saw my battlefield. That night, after tucking my daughter into her bed and kissing her forehead, I walked downstairs and sat at the kitchen table. I spread out the documents, the will, the deed, the notice Daniel had emailed me freshly printed. My grandmother's handwriting seemed to glow against the paper. I placed the notice in the center of the table, weighed down by a mug, perfectly positioned so that when they walked through the door, it would be the first thing they saw. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to fight. All I needed was ink on paper and 30 days. The silence of that kitchen was heavy, but for once, it wasn't suffocating. It was power. And I knew exactly what I was going to do with it. The kitchen was still and cold when I placed the eviction notice in the center of the table. I set it down like a landmine plain white paper against the wooden surface, waiting to detonate the moment my parents returned from their so-called vacation. The mug holding it in place wasn't accidental. It was my grandmother's favorite, the one with faded blue flowers along the rim, a quiet reminder of who really owned this house and why. For the next few days, I stayed in that house with my daughter. She was recovering, moving slowly from room to room, her stitches still tender, but her color was returning. Every time she smiled at me weak but genuine, I felt my resolve harden. I would never let her sit at that kitchen table with tears in her eyes while people who should love her mocked her. Not ever again. When the day finally came, I heard the rattle of suitcases across the porch before I saw them. The door opened and laughter spilled in with the summer heat. My parents entered first sunburned and smug, dragging their luggage behind them. Marissa followed perfectly put together despite the travel her husband trailing behind with their 2 kids glued to their phones. They froze when they saw me sitting at the table, and then they saw it, the paper. For a moment, silence hung in the air. My mother stepped forward, her heels clicking on the floor, and snatched it up. Her eyes scanned the words and her face turned a blotchy red. "What is this?" she demanded, shaking the paper. My father's jaw tightened, his nostrils flaring as he read over her shoulder. Marissa leaned in her smirk, faltering, her voice sharp. "You can't be serious. This is a joke, right?" I leaned back in my chair, calm, steady, sipping from my tea. "It's not a joke. You have 30 days to vacate." The will was clear. This house belongs to my daughter. I'm her guardian until she turns 18. My mother slammed the paper onto the table. "Ungrateful," she spat. "After everything we've done for you after raising you, you repay us like this." Raising me, I laughed, the sound dry and sharp. "You mean belittling me, mocking me, teaching me that my worth was measured against Marissa's shadow. You didn't raise me, you broke me, and now you're trying to do the same to my daughter." My father stepped closer, his voice low, venomous. "You'll regret this, Ashley. You're still the same failure you've always been. Don't pretend a piece of paper changes that." I met his glare head on. "Maybe I am a failure in your eyes, but I'm the failure who just gave you 30 days to find a new place to live." That shut him up. Marissa, ever the manipulator, tried a different tactic. She leaned across the table, her tone silky, almost pleading. "Ashley, think about what you're doing. This is family. You don't kick family out of their home. You've made your point. Tear it up. Don't destroy everything." I tilted my head, studying her. "If you care so much, Marissa, why don't they live with you? Surely the golden child has room for her parents." Her mouth snapped shut. The room erupted after that. My mother wailed about betrayal. My father barked about tradition and respect. Marissa ranted about tearing the family apart. The cousins whispered drama queen under their breath as if their childish chant could undo legal ink. I didn't move. I didn't shout. I didn't budge. "You have 30 days, I repeated, my voice like ice. The shouting went on for hours. Accusations slammed doors, whispered threats. But through it all, I stayed steady, calm, unmoving. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the energy in the house had shifted. They raged, but they knew. The clock had started ticking. The paper was on the table. And this time there was no undoing it. I knew my parents wouldn't go quietly, but even I underestimated how quickly they'd weaponize their favorite stage, social media. The very next morning, as I sat at the table spoon-feeding oatmeal to my daughter, my phone buzzed nonstop with notifications. Screenshots flooded in from cousins and old classmates, my parents' posts, Marissa's comments, distant relatives chiming in like a chorus of vultures. One picture showed my father sitting on the stairs of the house, head bowed, hand pressed dramatically against his forehead. The caption read, "Thrown out by our own daughter. After everything we sacrificed." Another post had my mother clutching a photo album to her chest, her eyes squeezed shut as if she were mourning the dead. The caption, "We gave her everything." She gave us nothing. Homeless at our age. Homeless. They were still in the house when they posted that. Still sleeping under the same roof as me, sipping their coffee from mugs in my kitchen. Yet online, they were already victims painting themselves as martyrs betrayed by the ungrateful child. And the comments poured in. How could she do this to you? Unbelievable. Family means everything. Ashley always was dramatic. I guess she finally snapped. The words stung, even though I told myself they shouldn't. I had lived my whole life as their scapegoat, but seeing it paraded online weaponized for likes and sympathy, it made my stomach twist. Worse, my daughter saw some of it when a friend messaged her. She sat beside me, her eyes wide with hurt. "Mom, they're lying about you," she whispered. I cupped her face gently. "I know, baby, that's what they do, but lies don't last forever." For the next week, it only escalated. Every day, new photos appeared, my father standing in front of packed boxes, my mother staring tragically out a window, Marissa posting cryptic stories about sisters who destroy families for greed. The relatives joined in too. Aunts I hadn't spoken to in years messaged me demanding explanations. Uncles I barely remembered left comments calling me heartless. Even old family friends weighed in their words, dripping with judgment. It was a smear campaign carefully orchestrated to make me the villain. And I let them. At first, I said nothing. I stayed quiet. I cooked dinner for my daughter, helped her with homework, tucked her into bed at night while the storm raged online. The silence wasn't weakness this time, it was strategy. Because I had something they didn't, proof. Every post they made painted them deeper into a corner. They played the role of abandoned parents so perfectly that they forgot the one thing the internet loves even more than sympathy receipts. And I had them. I had the hospital bracelet still looped around my daughter's wrist. I had discharge papers signed by surgeons. I had text messages, mine unanswered, theirs ignored. And most damning of all, I had the poolside selfie with its cruel caption, "Finally having peace without the pathetic drama queen." I saved everything organized into neat folders. And I waited. Because when I spoke, I wasn't going to shout. I wasn't going to argue. I was going to end their performance with the truth. The night I decided to strike back was eerily quiet. My parents had retreated to their bedroom after another long day of muttering ungrateful under their breath. Marissa had stopped by earlier delivering one of her sugar-coated ultimatums. "Just drop this before you embarrass yourself further. Everyone's already talking." Her words still hung in the air, sticky and smug. But I wasn't embarrassed. I was preparing. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, every screenshot, every document neatly organized. The poolside photo, the mocking caption, the discharge papers with the hospital's letterhead, a photo I had taken of my daughter's wristband still strapped to her tiny arm after surgery, the eviction notice with my grandmother's will attached. Proof, proof, proof. For years, I had been painted as the liar, the dramatist, the disappointment. Now I had the receipts. I drafted the post carefully. Not too long, not too defensive. Just enough truth to burn through the lies they'd spun. I uploaded a side-by-side image on the left, their smiling selfie by the pool with the caption, "Finally having peace without the pathetic drama queen." On the right, a picture of my daughter in her hospital bed, pale and fragile wires taped to her chest, the hospital wristband visible on her arm. And then I wrote, "During this family vacation, my 14-year-old daughter collapsed and was rushed into emergency surgery for appendicitis. While she was in the hospital fighting through pain, my parents and sister posted this photo mocking her as a drama queen. This house was left in trust to my daughter by my grandmother's will. I am her guardian. I will not allow people who laughed at her suffering to continue living under her roof." That's the truth. I read it 3 times, my hands trembling, not with fear, but with power. Then I hit post. The effect was instant. Notifications exploded on my phone, but this time they weren't full of accusations. They were full of outrage at my parents. People who had once rushed to their defense fell silent, their comments vanishing into thin air. Relatives who had called me cruel backpedaled, messaging me privately with half-hearted apologies. Distant family friends expressed shock, swearing they never knew the full story. The biggest shift, though, came from the strangers. Hundreds of comments poured in from people I didn't even know. "Your daughter deserves so much better. Stay strong." They called her dramatic while she was literally fighting for her life. Unforgivable. "Good for you for protecting her. Blood doesn't give anyone the right to abuse." My parents didn't post again. Marissa went conspicuously quiet, the chorus of distant relatives who had piled on silent. One by one, their voices evaporated, leaving only the weight of truth hanging in the air. I closed the laptop and sat back exhaling for what felt like the first time in years. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was clean. For once, the narrative wasn't theirs to control. It was mine. If silence is golden, then the silence in that house over the next 30 days was poisoned gold, shiny enough to fool outsiders, toxic enough to choke anyone living inside it. Every morning started the same. My father sat at the kitchen table with his newspaper, the rustling louder than it needed to be, as if the sound itself could cut me down. My mother made coffee, slamming cupboards and rattling spoons. Each clang was a dagger. They spoke little, but when they did, their words dripped venom. Ungrateful, heartless, single mothers never last. They muttered it just loud enough for me to hear, never looking me directly in the eye. My daughter shuffled carefully through the house stitches, still healing her steps slow. Every time she passed them in the hall, their eyes cut into her cold and accusing, like she'd stolen something precious from them instead of fighting for her life. It was suffocating, and yet I held my ground. The eviction notice had started the clock ticking, and with every day that passed, I felt the weight of my grandmother's words. One day you'll need this to protect her. My parents didn't just try to make our days unbearable. They escalated. When their pity show on social media dried up after my counterpost, they sought other weapons. They called extended family crying into phones about betrayal. They cornered mutual friends spinning tales of me being manipulative, vindictive, unstable. They even invited distant cousins over to visit, staging themselves in the living room like martyrs on display, hoping the whispers would ripple back to me. I didn't fight them, not directly. I didn't slam cupboards back. I didn't scream over their mutters. I documented every staged phone call, every guilt-laden message that dripped into my inbox, every thinly veiled threat. I kept screenshots, recordings, notes. My laptop became a vault of their venom, each file labeled and dated, each piece of evidence neatly stacked like ammunition. But the hardest part wasn't enduring their pettiness. It was shielding my daughter from it. One night she came into my room, her eyes wet. "Mom, why do they hate me so much?" The question pierced me deeper than anything my parents had ever said. I pulled her close, hugging her so tightly she squeaked, "Baby, they don't hate you. They hate losing control. They spent their whole lives treating people badly because they thought they could, and now for the first time they can't. That's not your fault. That's their weakness." She nodded, but her eyes stayed troubled. At 14, she was old enough to understand cruelty, but still too young to know how to carry its weight. I promised myself she wouldn't have to carry it much longer. As the days crawled by, the tension thickened. My father would stand in the hallway and just stare. Long, heavy stares meant to intimidate, to remind me of the child I once was, silent, small, afraid. My mother would sigh dramatically any time I walked into a room, her shoulders slumping as if I'd drained the life from her. Marissa, of course, couldn't resist playing both sides. She came by once, all perfume and false sympathy. She sat across from me at the table, her eyes sharp. "You've made your point," she said, voice dripping with condescension. "Stop now before you destroy the family completely." I stirred my tea slowly, deliberately calm. The family was destroyed the moment you all laughed at my daughter's pain. Her mask cracked for a split second, her lips twitching before she forced them into a tight smile. "You'll regret this." Probably, I said, meeting her eyes, but I'll regret staying silent a lot more. She left in a storm of indignation perfume lingering in the air long after the door slammed shut. The final week was the worst. My parents posted one last desperate attempt online, a grainy photo of packed boxes in the hallway captioned, "30 years of memories erased by betrayal." But the comments didn't roll in this time. The relatives who had once screamed the loudest were now conspicuously absent. My counterattack had silenced them. The proof had silenced them. The house itself felt like it was holding its breath. Every wall heavy with anticipation, every door creaking like it knew what was coming. And then finally the 30 days ended. I woke up that morning to the sound of my father's voice, low and bitter, urging my mother to hurry. Boxes thumped against the floor, suitcases zipped. My mother cried quietly, but there was no audience left to clap for her performance. I stood at the top of the stairs, my daughter beside me, both of us watching silently as they dragged their lives out the door. For once, I didn't feel like the powerless child they had raised me to be. For once, I felt like the guardian my grandmother had believed I could be. That morning, the air in the house felt lighter. Still tense, still electric, but lighter, like the moment before a storm finally breaks. For 30 days, I had listened to cupboards slam, endured sighs heavy with contempt, walked past glares sharp enough to cut skin. But on that day, the noise was different. It wasn't defiance. It was defeat. I stood at the top of the stairs with my daughter watching as my parents moved like shadows through the rooms they had once claimed as their own. Boxes thumped against the hardwood. Suitcases rolled across the floor. My father's jaw was locked tight, his face flushed with rage he couldn't unleash without an audience. My mother wept loudly as she carried out framed photos and mismatched knickknacks, every sob a performance. But this time, no one applauded. They tried to stall, of course. My father lingered in the living room, staring at the mantel as if he could claim it through sheer willpower. My mother stood in the kitchen, fingers grazing the countertop, whispering, "So many meals cooked here," like she was eulogizing a loved one. But the truth was written in the paper they had tried to ignore. The house was never theirs. It was never mine. It was my daughter's. And their time was up. Marissa arrived halfway through the move, her car pulling into the driveway with a screech. She swept into the house in a cloud of perfume and indignation, her children trailing behind her like ducklings. "This is insanity!" She spat her heels, clicking against the tile as she confronted me. "You can't just throw Mom and Dad out like garbage. Do you have any idea what people are saying?" I looked her dead in the eye. People are finally saying the truth. She blinked, thrown off by my calmness. For years, she had thrived on my flustered apologies, my defensive stammers. Now, she found nothing but ice. "If you care so much," I added, my voice steady, "why don't you let them live with you?" The silence that followed was brutal. Her perfect smile faltered, her jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Her husband shifted uncomfortably by the door, clearly unwilling to host the parents-in-law from hell. For the first time, Marissa had no comeback. The rest of the move was ugly but quiet. Boxes loaded into cars, doors slamming, my mother muttering curses under her breath, my father glaring at me like he wanted to etch hatred into my skin. When the last box was gone, my parents stood in the doorway, their faces twisted with rage and humiliation. My mother's voice shook as she hissed, "You'll regret this, Ashley. You've destroyed this family." I smiled small but sharp. "No, I've saved mine." They left without another word. The door closed behind them with a finality that made the walls of the house exhale. For the first time in decades, the space felt free, like the poison had finally been drained. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was clean, peaceful, almost sacred. I turned to my daughter. She stood beside me, her stitches healing, her eyes wide with cautious hope. "Are they really gone?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," I said, pulling her into a hug. "They're gone." She smiled then, a small, tired but genuine smile. "It feels different already." And it did. We walked through the rooms together that evening, just the two of us. Every creak of the floorboards, every echo of our footsteps sounded new, untainted. In her bedroom, she stretched out across her bed sketchbook in her lap, humming quietly to herself. For once, there was no muttering from downstairs, no accusations hanging in the air. Just peace. I stood in the doorway watching her and realized this wasn't just a house anymore. It was home. For days after they left the house felt like it was breathing differently. The air seemed lighter, as if invisible weights had been lifted from the beams and floorboards. For the first time in years, I could walk into the kitchen without bracing myself for a mutter or a glare. The cupboards stayed shut unless we opened them. The silence wasn't poisoned anymore. It was peaceful. My daughter noticed it too. She healed faster, her color returning, her energy bubbling back. I'd catch her singing under her breath while doing homework at the table, or laughing at some silly show without glancing nervously toward the door to see who was listening. One night, I walked past her room and saw her sprawled across her bed sketchbook, open, drawing wide, bold strokes like she wasn't afraid to take up space anymore. It hit me hard this was what safety looked like. But peace in our home didn't mean peace outside. I started hearing whispers about my parents. They had dragged their boxes over to Marissa's house after the eviction, stuffing themselves into her pristine suburban palace with her husband and kids. At first, Marissa put on a brave face, online selfies of family dinners, captions about sticking together. But behind the curtain, it was chaos. Too many people under one roof. My father barking orders like it was still his house. My mother sighing and criticizing every little thing. The cousins fighting constantly, their laughter now drowned out by slammed doors and screaming matches. It didn't last. Within 3 months, Marissa cracked. Her husband had enough. One night she threw them out bags on the lawn, voices raised so loud, a neighbor recorded it and posted it online. The golden child's perfect image shattered overnight. And my parents. They ended up renting a small, dingy apartment on the far edge of town. For two people who prided themselves on appearances, it was the ultimate humiliation. And me, I didn't gloat, I didn't post, I didn't call. I just lived. I started renting out the spare room in the house, a quiet tenant who paid on time, which allowed me to cut back hours at work. That meant more evenings at home with my daughter, cooking together, watching movies, actually living instead of just surviving. Our circle grew 2 new friends, neighbors who stopped by with casseroles, parents of my daughter's classmates who welcomed us without judgment. Life became ours finally. Sometimes I'd still hear about my parents through relatives. My mother still posting cryptic statuses about betrayal. My father sitting silently in the background of her photos, his eyes dull. Marissa. She stopped talking to me altogether, her pride too wounded to even attempt reconciliation. And honestly, that was fine. One evening, about a year later, I sat on the porch with my daughter, the summer air warm against our skin. She leaned her head on my shoulder and said softly, "It's better now, isn't it?" I nodded, kissing her hair. "Yeah, baby, it's better now." Because it was. The house was ours, the peace was ours, the freedom was ours. And for the first time, I realized I hadn't just broken the cycle for her. I had broken it for me, too.